Did you know we can experience up to 500 emotional moments in a single day? Our brain processes countless emotional signals, but we only notice a few. Often, just 20 to 40 stand out. Still, even those can shape our relationships, decisions, and sense of self. There are moments when something stirs inside, a knot in the stomach, a rush of heat in the chest, a small pain behind the eyes. And then we act or react or shut down. Later, we wonder, what was that really about? Most of us were never taught how to read emotions. We try to manage or suppress them without understanding the signals beneath. But emotions are here to move us, movere, to move out. They are not problems, they are messages. In this episode, I want to slow things down, not with theory, but with clarity. We'll explore the emotions underneath the surface. And I'll share tools to help you respond with intention, not impulse. Emotional intelligence begins with something simple: noticing, naming, navigating. Let's begin.
Hey there and welcome. Today we're getting into something really central to, well, everything we do, our emotions.
That's right. How they shape our thinking, guide what we do.
Exactly. And stick around because we promise some really practical stuff you can use by the end.
We're going to be talking about emotional intelligence, EQ. It's something that's getting a lot more attention now, alongside the usual focus on IQ.
People probably remember Daniel Goleman's big book back in '95.
Yeah, emotional intelligence. That really brought it into the mainstream, though it built on, earlier academic work.
And it's not just theory. There was that study, I think 2015, in the Journal of Organizational Behavior.
Oh yeah, Moll and colleagues. They found that people who were better at recognizing emotions in faces and voices and had good interpersonal skills.
They actually earned more.
They did, higher salaries. The idea was these skills help you navigate sort of the workplace social stuff, the politics, the interactions.
Interesting. So people have thought about emotions for ages, obviously.
For centuries. But this idea of EQ as skills you can actually develop and improve, that's more recent.
Okay, so let's maybe start back a bit. What were some of the early thoughts on how we actually show emotions, like expressions?
Well, a really key starting point is Charles Darwin.
Darwin, okay.
Yeah, he basically saw emotional expressions, facial expressions and such, as visible signs of what's going on inside. What you see reflects the internal feeling.
But I feel like I remember reading that wasn't the only view, especially later on.
You're right. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and you get this other perspective popping up.
Which was?
That maybe facial expressions weren't direct readouts of feelings, but more like social signals, things learned within a culture.
So learned, not innate.
That was the debate. And some early findings were messy. Brunner and Taguri, in a review around 1954, basically said the evidence for universal recognition wasn't really there, suggesting maybe it was culturally learned.
So the picture was kind of confusing back then.
It was. Are they innate? Are they learned? Now we kind of think it's a bit of both, really. Some core things might be universal, but culture shapes a lot.
Okay, so what brought Darwin's idea, the universality thing, back into favor?
Well, the big shift came with Ekman, Friesen, and Ellsworth in 1972.
Right. Ekman's name comes up a lot here.
He's central. Their work really aimed to support Darwin's universality idea, and they provided some pretty compelling evidence. Later work by Ekman and also Ezard built on that.
So that research sort of solidified the idea of universal expressions again.
It really swung the pendulum back, yeah. Made people rethink the link between inner feeling and outer expression.
Which leads us nicely to this concept of basic emotions.
Yeah.
Darwin talked about lots of feelings, but not necessarily a specific set of basic ones, right?
Exactly. Darwin's descriptions were broad. The idea of, say, 6 or 7 fundamental or basic emotions, each tied to a distinct facial expression that's more strongly associated with Paul Ekman's work from around 72.
And those are,
Usually happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, and maybe contempt. Ekman proposed these are linked to specific facial patterns through, hardwired programs.
But wait, if they're hardwired, why don't we always see perfect textbook examples of these faces?
Good point. That's where Ekman's theory gets more nuanced. He talked about display rules.
Display rules.
Yeah, basically the social norms we learn. When is it okay to show anger? How much surprise should you display? Culture teaches us these rules which modify the basic expression.
Gotcha. So the basic program is there, but society tells us how to tweak it.
Sort of, yeah. That's the idea behind his neocultural theory.
Okay, but is there solid evidence for these basic emotions beyond just the theory?
Oh, definitely. A big piece is cross-cultural recognition studies, showing faces to people in vastly different cultures and seeing if they agree on the emotion. Ekman, Izard, and others found pretty high agreement.
What else?
Well, there's comparative research with primates seeing similar-looking expressions in apes and monkeys.
Hmm.
Though, you have to be careful there. It's tricky to be 100% sure an expression is homologous, truly the same, or what the animal is actually feeling.
True.
Any other evidence?
Studies on infants before they've had much social learning show some of these basic facial patterns. And some neurological studies also seem to offer support.
So multiple lines of evidence pointing towards these basic emotions.
Yes, but with caveats, especially for the comparative stuff.
Now, you mentioned Ekman used these like single prototypical expressions, one face for sad, one face for angry. Is that how it really works?
That's a really important question. Both Darwin and Ekman often use these clear, single examples, but...
But life's messier.
Exactly. Research going back to the early 20th century, and later studies too, like Wiggers in '82, showed that in real situations, people might show a range of expressions when feeling an emotion. Or one emotion might be linked to several different expressions in recognition tasks.
So you might recognize the classic sad face, but someone feeling sad might actually look different sometimes.
Precisely. And this leads to a bit of a puzzle.
Which is?
While those prototypical faces are highly recognizable across cultures, people generally agree that's fear or that's happiness.
Okay.
There's actually less consistent evidence that people reporting they feel, say, anger, reliably produce that specific prototypical angry face every time.
Huh. So we recognize the stereotype, but don't always produce it.
Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Some studies find links between self-reported feelings and specific expressions, but others find weaker connections. It's not as clear-cut as you might think.
Why would that be? Why the disconnect?
Well, one idea is that maybe facial expressions aren't just about reflecting the internal emotion.
What else could they be about?
They might arise more from how we're appraising the social context when we feel the emotion. Like, what does the situation mean? What do I need to signal to others?
So the expression is shaped by the situation, not just the feeling inside.
That's a possibility, yeah. Scherer and others have proposed ideas along those lines. The context matters.
Okay, this loops back to universality then. Darwin thought expressions were universal based on his surveys.
He did. He sent out questionnaires asking people in different parts of the world to describe expressions and concluded they were fundamentally the same everywhere.
But we said earlier, 20th century research didn't always back that up.
Right. Initially, the findings were inconsistent. That's when Ekman and his colleagues came along and criticized the methods of those earlier studies.
They said the studies were flawed.
Essentially, yes. They argued the designs weren't good enough to really test universality, and then they presented their own cross-cultural studies as stronger evidence for Darwin's view.
But did everyone just accept Ekman's findings then? Was the debate over?
Oh, definitely not. The debate continued and still does to some extent. People like Russell question the methodologies used in those universality studies too, things like using forced choice answers.
Forced choice, like pick the emotion from this list.
Exactly. Critics argued that might inflate agreement. And then you have the social constructivist perspective, pointing to big differences in how cultures talk about emotions.
Like different emotion words.
Yeah. Wordsbicka, for instance, highlighted how languages carve up the emotional world differently, suggesting maybe the emotions themselves aren't perfectly universal.
So where does that leave us? Is it universal or is it cultural?
I think most researchers now land somewhere in the middle.
Bit of both.
Pretty much. Acknowledging that there are likely some universal foundations, maybe tied to those basic emotions, but also significant cultural variation in how emotions are expressed, perceived, and even experienced. Fisk, Mosqueda, others talk about this interplay. It's not fully resolved.
Okay, so complex picture. We have emotions, we express them, maybe universally, maybe culturally, probably both. But why? What's the point of having emotions in the first place?
Fundamental question. Well, one key purpose seems to be motivation. Strong emotions can really energize us to act, to overcome challenges.
Like fear making you run or anger making you stand up for something?
Exactly. They push us. And they're crucial for communication.
Communicating with others.
Absolutely. Our facial expressions, especially, are incredibly rapid signals, often faster than words. Our body language, our tone of voice, they all broadcast our emotional state, whether we intend them to or not.
And it's hard to fake sometimes.
Right.
Or hide.
Very hard, especially with strong emotions. These signals evolve to influence others.
But emotions don't just communicate outwards, do they? They tell us things too.
Definitely. They act as internal signals, important information about what's happening and what matters to us, that gut feeling you sometimes get.
Yeah.
That can be your emotional system giving you a quick read on a situation. Intuition, some call it.
Right. Like an internal alarm bell.
It can be. But, and this is important, we shouldn't always treat emotions as facts.
What do you mean? An emotion isn't a fact.
Well, the feeling is real, but the story we attach to it might not be accurate. Just because I feel anxious doesn't automatically mean there's a real danger. Just because I feel incompetent doesn't mean I am.
Ah, okay. So the feeling is information, but not necessarily the whole truth about the situation.
Precisely. Feeling lonely doesn't mean being alone is inherently bad. Feeling afraid doesn't always mean danger is present. We have to check the facts, not just react to the intensity of the feeling.
That's a crucial distinction. So given how powerful they are, and sometimes misleading, how do we manage them? How do we regulate emotions?
That brings us right to emotion regulation. James Gross defined it back in '98 as basically the strategies we use, consciously or unconsciously, to influence which emotions we have, when we have them, and how we experience and express them.
Influencing them.
Yeah.
Like turning the volume up or down.
Yeah, or changing the channel altogether. Gross developed a really useful model for this.
The process model.
That's the one. It highlights 5 points where we can intervene. First, situation selection, just avoiding situations that trigger unwanted emotions, or seeking out ones that cause good ones.
Okay, makes sense. Avoid the argument, go for a walk in the park.
Right. Second, situation modification. Actively changing the situation you're in. Like if a conversation is getting heated, suggesting a break.
Got it. What's third?
Attentional deployment. Shifting your focus, distracting yourself, or concentrating on a non-emotional aspect of the situation.
Okay. Fourth.
Cognitive change. This is a big one, reappraisal. Changing how you think about the situation to alter its emotional meaning. Finding a silver lining, seeing it from another perspective.
Reappraisal. Heard that term. And fifth.
Response modulation. This happens once the emotion is already underway. Trying to directly influence your response, like taking deep breaths to calm down, or suppressing your facial expression.
5 points of intervention. And where does something like mindfulness come in?
Mindfulness is really relevant here, especially for attentional deployment and maybe cognitive change, and even response modulation. It's about noticing emotions without judgment.
Creating space.
Exactly, space between the feeling and the reaction.
Now, I've also heard about primary versus secondary emotions. That seems key for regulation too. Can you unpack that?
Absolutely. It's a really helpful distinction. Think of primary emotions, based on work like Damasio's, as the first, immediate, often instinctual reactions to something.
Like fear, joy, sadness.
Yes, often quite universal, tied to specific events or thoughts. They're the raw core feelings.
Okay, so what are secondary emotions?
Secondary emotions are essentially reactions to our primary emotions. They're learned, more complex, shaped by our thoughts, beliefs, experiences.
So like feeling ashamed because you felt afraid. Or guilty because you felt angry.
Perfect examples. Secondary emotions often pop up when we judge our primary emotion. I shouldn't feel angry, which then leads to guilt. Or feeling sad makes me weak, leading to shame.
And these secondary ones can mask the primary ones.
Very often, yes. They can act like a defense mechanism. We react with anger, secondary, to cover up underlying hurt or fear, primary.
Are they easier to control?
Sometimes they feel easier to manage in the moment, or they're more socially acceptable maybe, but they can also numb us, disconnect us from what's really going on underneath.
The source mentioned some common pairings, like primary joy might lead to secondary hopeful or proud feelings. Fear could become anxiety. Anger might turn into resentment. Sadness into shame or depression. Surprise into confusion.
Those are great examples. They show how the initial feeling gets processed through our thoughts and judgments, leading to that secondary layer. A lot of this can stem from our upbringing, what emotions were okay to show, what weren't.
So the advice is usually to try and get to the primary emotion.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Because that's where the core information is. Experiencing primary emotions involves vulnerability, sure, but it's incredibly useful.
Useful how?
It helps us understand our real needs, solve problems at their root, connect more authentically with others. Avoiding the primary stuff just keeps us stuck reacting to the surface level. Vulnerability allows for connection and growth.
Okay, but how do you do that? How do you dig down to the primary feeling when the secondary one is shouting louder?
It takes practice. One way is tuning into your body. Primary emotions often have strong physical sensations. Tightness, heat, energy, heaviness. Where do you feel it?
Pay attention to the body. What else?
Notice the quality. Primary emotions often feel fresh or immediate, whereas secondary ones can feel more stale or ruminative. Try to separate the thoughts about the feeling from the raw sensation itself.
Like I feel tightness in my chest versus this is awful, I can't cope.
Exactly. Ask yourself gentle questions. What's underneath this anger? What am I really afraid of here? Look for shifts sometimes. The primary emotion breaks through briefly. And notice your impulses. What does the feeling make you want to do? That can be a clue.
And knowing the primary emotion helps with what exactly?
It helps you understand your triggers, address the real issue, increase self-awareness, and ultimately regulate your emotions more effectively because you're dealing with the source, not just the symptom. Better interactions, too.
Let's go back to mindfulness for a second. You mentioned it helps. How specifically does it tie into regulating these emotions, maybe primary and secondary?
Well, there's a lot of interest in mindfulness-based approaches for emotion issues, and researchers are trying to understand the specific mechanisms.
And mechanisms like?
We can think about top-down versus bottom-up strategies within mindfulness.
Top-down meaning cognitive stuff.
Yeah.
Like reappraisal.
Exactly. Using your thinking mind to change your perspective. Mindfulness can support that, but it also heavily involves bottom-up processing.
Bottom-up. More body focus.
Yes, focusing on direct sensory experience.
Yeah.
Noticing bodily sensations, temperature, tension, space around you, internal feelings without getting caught up in analyzing them, just feeling them.
So less thinking about the sadness, more just noticing the heaviness in your chest.
Precisely. MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, talks about opening the door of the body, letting the physical sensations be there without judgment or rumination. It's a direct encounter with the feeling.
And this connects to how emotions and thoughts influence each other.
Right. Our emotional state affects what we notice and how we think, which then affects how we regulate. It's a continuous loop. This leads to the idea of embodied emotion regulation. Meaning, you can't really separate the emotion from the regulation. It's all one integrated process involving top-down thinking, bottom-up sensations, body, brain, all interacting constantly to generate and manage our internal state.
That's a really holistic view. Okay, shifting gears slightly, let's get super practical. What are some core skills people can learn?
Okay, concrete skills. One fundamental one is checking the facts.
We touched on that, seeing if the emotion fits the situation.
Yes, and also asking, is the intensity appropriate? And is acting on this urge going to be effective in the long run?
And if the answer is no, the emotion doesn't fit or isn't helpful,
then you might try opposite action.
doing the opposite of what the emotion tells you to do.
Exactly. Identify the action urge. Fear makes you want to run. Anger makes you want to attack, and then deliberately do the opposite over and over until the emotion shifts.
Can you give examples again? Like for fear?
Fear urges avoidance. Opposite action approach. Do what you're afraid of, safely, repeatedly. Do things to feel competent and in control in the situation.
Anger. Urges to attack, yell.
Opposite action. Gently avoid the person or situation temporarily. Take a time out. Try to be kind. Maybe find some empathy.
Disgust. Urges to push away, avoid.
Opposite. Maybe engage with what feels disgusting. Be kind towards it. Approach what feels unclean if it's safe and necessary.
Sadness. Urges to withdraw, be inactive.
Opposite. Get active. Schedule pleasant activities. Engage with the world. Pay attention to the present. Change your posture. Stand tall. Move your body.
What about trickier ones, like love when it's causing problems?
Right.
Or shame?
Right. For love that's unhelpful or unjustified, maybe towards someone harmful, the opposite action is to avoid the person, distract yourself, remind yourself of the reasons it's not working, avoid reminders, stop expressing the love, maybe even act a bit unfriendly.
And shame, if it's not justified by the facts.
Opposite action is to do the opposite of hiding. Share the characteristic or behavior you feel ashamed of with people you trust won't reject you. Repeat the behavior, if it's safe and not harmful, without hiding.
What if guilt is justified or shame is justified?
If guilt is justified, the skillful action isn't opposite action, it's repair. Apologize, make amends, commit to not doing it again, accept the consequences, and then practice self-forgiveness. If shame is justified by social norms, what you did would lead to rejection. Maybe hiding the behavior is appropriate initially while using interpersonal skills, and maybe working to change the behavior or find a group with different values.
Okay, so opposite action is powerful, but needs that. Check the facts first. Any other big strategies?
Problem solving is another key skill if the emotion is triggered by a specific life problem. Identify the problem clearly, check facts, set a realistic goal, brainstorm solutions, pick one, try it out.
Makes sense. Deal with the source.
And proactively building positive experiences is huge.
How does that work?
Accumulating positives. Scheduling pleasant events, even small ones, regularly. Hobbies, time with friends, relaxation, enjoying nature. It builds emotional reserve.
Like building up a buffer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also building mastery, setting small, achievable goals and working towards them. Feeling competent reduces vulnerability to negative emotions.
And planning for tough times.
That's cope ahead. If you know a difficult situation is coming, mentally rehearse it. Describe the situation. Plan specific coping skills, like opposite action or mindfulness. Imagine yourself coping effectively.
Preparing yourself. You also mentioned please skills earlier.
Yes. It's an acronym for physical self-care, which massively impacts emotional regulation. PL is treat physical illness. E is balance eating. A is avoid mood-altering substances. S is balance sleep. And E is get exercise. Basic stuff, but foundational.
Taking care of the body to take care of the mind.
Absolutely. And finally, just mindfulness of the current emotion itself. Observing it without judgment, accepting its presence, remembering you are not the emotion, riding the wave.
Wow, that's a really comprehensive toolkit. Let's quickly bring this back to the workplace where we started. We know EQ links to salary. What else?
Well, higher EQ generally means more calmness, clearer thinking under pressure. That supports better decision-making, more accurate perception of situations, and even increased creativity.
And adapting to change, handling setbacks.
Definitely. Research suggests EQ fosters adaptability and helps people manage setbacks more resiliently, learn from failure. It's also consistently linked to leadership potential. Teams rate leaders higher if they perceive them as having strong EQ.
What about teamwork? Does individual EQ affect the group?
Hugely. Remember the elective intelligence study? Social sensitivity, basically, being attuned to others' emotions and perspectives, was a major predictor of how well teams performed. When people are aware, participation is more even, collaboration is better.
So for a company or organization, fostering EQ seems like a no-brainer.
The evidence suggests it pays off. Better sales, better recruitment and retention, better customer service, team performance, productivity, revenue, and fewer negatives like turnover, absenteeism, accidents, conflicts. It really touches almost everything.
The impact is just undeniable, really. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What are the main takeaways today?
We've journeyed from early ideas about emotion expression, like Darwin's, through the development of concepts like basic emotions. We talked about the universality debate.
And the difference between primary and secondary emotions that felt really key. Understanding what's underneath.
Absolutely. And then we moved into practical ways to manage emotions, checking facts, opposite action, mindfulness, problem solving, taking care of ourselves with please skills.
And tying it all back to emotional intelligence, EQ, showing how developing these awareness and regulation skills isn't just for personal well-being, but links to tangible success, professionally and personally.
That's the core message. It's all interconnected.
So maybe a good encouragement for everyone listening is just to start noticing. Pay a bit more attention to your own emotional landscape day to day.
Yeah, and maybe pick one small thing we talked about, perhaps noticing body sensations, or trying opposite action for a minor frustration and just experiment. See what happens.
And maybe a final thought to leave people with. How could understanding just one of your common primary emotions a bit better, or practicing one regulation skill consistently, make a positive difference in one specific part of your life, maybe a relationship or a recurring challenge?
That's a great question to ponder. Thanks so much for tuning in to this exploration of our emotional world.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Hope it was helpful.